Hi everybody, Steve Maker. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we are going to close out our discussion on Hermann brain dominance and then move into a request to take a look at a model that's been put forth by human synergistics. And this is something that David Harrell is very interested in. And so we'll see if David joins in. I'll also give you guys a bit of a heads up. We've also had a request to take a look at the predictive index. Is that what it's called? I think predictive index, and see how it might overlay on the change grid, and have a little bit of fun with that. This series started being labeled as learning models and where they all fall in the change grid. And then we very quickly realized that none of these models that are referred to as learning models were ever framed by the developers of those models as learning models. And so they call them something else for other reasons. And so it kind of opened up the door to just say, well, let's just look at a bunch of different models of curiosity, and let's see how it overlays, and what its purpose is a totally different dialogue than that. So David, just so you know, we've got your human synergistics model ready to kind of show too. But I did want to put one thing, it's not really, there's not a debate around. I just needed to make sure I'm clear with the objectives of performing the merging of brilliance. So whenever we are looking at any of these models and we're seeing how they overlay, it's all a very interesting intellectual and academic sort of an exercise. And I think you guys have played with these things enough to understand that when I say that any model of human behavior that seems to make sense standing all by itself should make even more sense when you combine it with all the other models that we know make sense standing on themselves. And that shouldn't be something that's, even all that debatable, because everyone's trying to describe the exact same thing. And that's how a human operates. And so one person's map of human behavior and another person's map of human behavior and dozens of other maps of human behavior, they should all coincide with one another. They should all interrelate or map to one another, because again, they're all describing the exact same final destination. So by merging them all together, what we hope to do is to get greater clarity around what is the truth, what is a consistent thing that comes up over and over again that we can go, yep, that makes even more sense now that we're getting more and more reinforcement, more and more insights. Also, the result of performing this merging of brilliance kind of exercise is that it helps shake out the blind spots or shortcomings that any model has. So I always say that I don't care what the model is. You're going to be blessed by its insights, and you're going to have to deal with whatever its blind spots happen to be. So the more we merge together, the fewer or the smaller and smaller the blind spot becomes, and the deeper and deeper clarity we find around what's going on. So I'll add to that one last thing, and then I'd like to get your guys' kind of thoughts around what I'm saying here, is that, okay, big deal. We can show how a particular model overlays on the change grid. Good for us, yay. But what does it contribute to what it is that we're doing? What are we really looking for? How is this going to change any way, shape, or form that we go about using the change grid? Well, I want to make sure there's that I bring forth a few things around that. So first of all, by being able to integrate these other models into the change grid, we are then able to say to someone who is already comfortable or fluent with a particular model that we have looked it over, we know how it overlays, and here's what we can add to that, and here's what we can do with it as a result. And so I think being able to do these mergings helps give us greater flexibility in connecting with the clients that we have, who, some of them are hopelessly devoted to one instrument or the other. And we don't want to tell them that that instrument is, not good, bad, or, we don't want to in any way make them feel like we're questioning their choice. We just go like, oh yeah, we can certainly show you how that all blends in with what we're doing. But as far as our own purposes, we're not looking to put more layers on the change grid, although these discussions in the past week or so have made me wonder if I need to add one more layer to the change grid just to explain some of the stuff that we've been chatting about. But what it really is going to boil down to is that comprehensive adjective map. So what all models of human behavior do is one way or another, they end up reducing their insights to a set of adjectives that describe a particular area of their model, or whether it's the, as we were talking about for Herrmann brain dominance, is it the shadow side, is it the bright side? But it's going to give us all these adjectives. Well, we should be able then to extract those adjectives, take a look at the comprehensive adjective map, see which adjectives are missing from the new set that's coming in from doing this merging, and go, okay, let's add the adjectives. Where do these adjectives go? Does it help us scoot an adjective into a better place? But ultimately, the merging of brilliance exercise is all about fleshing out that comprehensive adjective map. So there's a few minutes of a babble, but someone brought up the question about what's the point of doing these mergings? Now, those are the points of doing the mergings. So questions, comments, is it just a fun academic exercise for you guys, or do you see value in it beyond that? Thoughts?
Yeah, I learn and I keep looking at what we're doing as giving me more clues to work with my clients. So
Okay.
no, I don't see it as superfluous at all.
Excellent. Good, good, good. Yeah, and someone also said that that every time we do it, they're although they're big change grid believers, it just makes them believe that the change grid really is a comprehensive map of all the ways the humans might end up behaving. So they just viewed it as a way also of giving them further evidence of the change grid is a useful thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Other
that's my
thoughts?
thinking of it. I tend to think about it from the perspective of behavior itself. No behavior exists in a vacuum.
Mhm.
So what these models and what the change grid helps to understand is what's underneath the behavior.
Mhm,
It's one
mhm.
thing to say, okay, this is, what you might test out as on an assessment or something. It's another thing to be aware of what's driving that behavior, because for the most part, a lot of the unconscious processes are driving behavior. So if you're unaware of them, there's nothing to change.
Right, 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 right. And in fact, Brian, last time around, we were looking at where these four Herrmann brain dominance areas overlay on the change grid. Again, for the most part, it's all confined more to the central area of the change grid. When we get to the extremes, that's when we start seeing some of these shadow kinds of qualities, where the shadow side of each one of the quadrants. But one question that came up last time around, and I know you weren't able to join us on the call, but I said, I wonder if this preference of exercising a particular section of the brain or living more in that section of the brain as being our home base personality wise, is that what's driving our neurotransmitters? Or our neurotransmitters ultimately what makes our personality? So I guess what I'm saying is that maybe every one of us have a certain unique bowl of neurochemical soup. And whatever that bowl of neurochemical soup looks like, as our standard bowl, our regular bowl, that's where we end up kind of calling home base on the change grid, because that's where
Yeah,
yeah.
that's exactly right. The toggling, if you will, between the cortex and the limbic system, it creates what's called a default mode network.
uh,
So again, so all behaviors have, I simply call it an app. All behaviors have an association. They have a specific pattern. They have specific processes that support that pattern. And it turns out to be kind of like its own algorithm. So it's like a program.
yeah, yeah.
So, and that's for our thinking, that's for our emotions, that's for how we handle everything. So think about something simple like a task of driving, right? We're conscious of it when we first do it. But the more repetitive it becomes, now you have a strong synaptic connection. And so that consciousness in the cortex is now outsourced to the limbic system, to an area called the basal ganglia. And so you don't have to think about driving while you're driving. It's automated now.
Yeah, which is kind of scary in its own way.
Right. So we do
And
this all the
so, okay, we've always said that personality is in part nature and in part nurture.
time. Right.
So, are we also then saying that part of personality is the bowl of soup that you are born with, that is then the seasonings change based on how you've been conditioned over the course of your lifetime? Does does conditioning change your neurochemical soup?
Yes, it can. In fact, that's where environment and these kinds of things play a significant role in behavior. So again, what these assessments, what the change they bring to me is this idea, okay, whatever is showing up, whatever you brought to the table in terms of your behavior, there's something underneath that's driving it.
Mhm.
That's what we want to get to, because though again, the strongest synaptic connection is what is going to appear. And it's the same thing we said, people pay attention to where they find their greatest tension.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so it follows the same pathway when we're talking about neurotransmitters.
Okay,
So
good.
that's why
Good.
people may want to change, they think about change, but then there's this gap between intention and action. And if they don't understand how to work within that gap, then they may not take enough action to create enough change.
Right, right. Interesting, interesting. Okay, Wayne's just chatted a message over to all of us. So Wayne, if you want, why don't you just go ahead and unmute and share with us about format. Format was one of the models that was listed on this grand list of learning models that we were supposed to be taking a look at. If I go back here, I think yeah, format was one of those models. So by all means, jump in and tell us a little bit about format. And
Sure. I did this exercise mapping the format against the change grid years ago, and part of what came out of that, it's a quadrant-based model. The idea being that there is a specific sequence that McCarthy wants you to go through to follow format. It uses the compass rose directions of Kolb's experiential learning theory from early on, and McCarthy and Kolb were cohorts in parallel with each other doing research in the 80s and 90s. So not surprising that they have overlap. But McCarthy's format, she said, fine, do these things in this order to design an experience that your students can go through that starts with a concrete experience, goes through the questions, addressing the questions of why for the students, has that reflective observation, moving into more of a what focus, that's where the content actually gets shared. Then you're into the abstract conceptualization, which is where we usually think of school living. And you progress through the question of how do you apply this to then get out into active experimentation. And she likes the word if to go from active experimentation back to that concrete experience. I tend to think of it as where else? Where else can I go apply this to? So with all of those pieces there, it was a fun exercise to say, okay, that sequence is great and all. And then when we go map it to the change grid, the quick version is the Y starts more in grid, the what goes down grid, then we go out grid with the how, and we end up more up grid with the what else, where else, what if.
Very interesting.
And when I initially came across this model, I was comparing and contrasting with what we often talk about from the NLP side in terms of people going from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence to the conscious competence to conscious unconscious competence. And I'm like, that's actually circling the other direction on the change grid.
Yeah, yeah.
Which also explains why if you go through it in that sequence of unconscious incompetence all the way through to conscious unconscious competence,
yep,
that you kind of just stop when you get there.
Right,
because you've
because you're
now circled
unconscious.
and you sit down at the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah, we always said the
Whereas,
problem is you end up unconscious. So
yeah,
now, now you're
yeah,
waiting for something to happen to trigger your
yep.
consciousness back into play.
So the format model gives a little explanation of, oh, look, if we actually are circling the other
Mhm.
direction, that makes more sense why when we teach, we take them through that sequence. So
Right.
I treat it like we are building up momentum headed from in-grid to down-grid to swing through the down-grid, not stay there.
You're right. You're right.
I treat
Well,
it like a roller coaster
I
ride.
think another way I like to kind of frame it is that when we go through that whole unconscious, incompetent, that whole combination of things, I think we're just looking at what happens when humans are allowed to just go through things in their own good time, at their own good pace or whatever. And this is just the natural progression of things. Well, what you've just described from a learning model is instead of just doing something naturally, let's do something intentional.
Mhm,
And when
mhm.
we're doing something intentional, we're going like, no, let's go, we're going to move it back around. And if we take a look then at the change grid maneuvers, they should resonate because now we're basically saying, hey, well, we'll say we've ended up down grid. Well, this whole idea about moving from down grid to out grid, which is moving from the how to the, were your labels?
Out grid is how, down grid is what?
What? So moving from the what to the how, if you look at that, the upgrade maneuvers are increase the standards against which you're measuring something, change the task in some subtle or profound way, reawaken emotions, boost accountability. So these are the things that are basically saying before you just get lost down here in downgrid world, let's revisit what's the mission, what's the vision, what's the purpose, and that pulls us back into being, if you will, back into being fully engaged in doing something. And I think that's what you're talking about from an educational perspective. We got to get them from being in their heads more to being engaged with whatever it is that is being explored.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they do need to have some time in that down grid. Here's the what, the content itself. But if
Mhm.
you minimize the content, you're less likely to lose them in down grid apathy.
Right, right. If we bury people under too much content, then while we might be increasing their perceived ability and we might be reducing the perceived challenges just a result of the sheer volume of content that they're receiving, it's still, volume has weight. And it's going to pull them down, down, down from a tension perspective. And so I think you're absolutely right. We don't need to know everything. We just need to know enough.
Mhm.
And if we know the right amount of stuff and it's been delivered to us in the right sort of way, well, now we're probably more energized and liberated to go and do something with
Mhm.
whatever that content happens to have
See,
been.
that seems to map to master stream more than it does change works.
Well, definitely. I think that anytime, again, we were chatting about this last time around. When we look at a change grid, we tend to be looking at a single movement. There's a starting point and there's a desired place. How do we move them there? Well, most changes are far more complex than that simple movement. And that's where the master stream comes into play, particularly if we're trying to help someone do it, which is obviously what you'd be doing if you're the educator or if you're the consultant or whatever label you want to give yourself in the dynamic. You got to manage tension a lot more, say, a lot more, um, I was going to say carefully, but that's not really it. It's more
Well,
complex than meets the eye. Yep.
Master Stream has so many questions. You
Mhm.
know, the presentation phase is typically the solving phase is the smallest phase. You do it
Yep.
until you're done.
Yep.
But, this is, I mean, it would seem to exist more inside the green circle.
Yes. Well, certainly. Right. Yeah. If we're talking about good quality changes happening and good
Yep.
good development happening, well, it's interesting that usually what's happened to trigger a developmental experience is that ideally someone has encountered a situation between the green circle and the red circle. My way of putting it is life happened. And as life happened, there's this now awareness, if you will, of something needing to be different or an opportunity for something to be different for whatever benefits might come along with that. And so we go like, ooh, now we got some work to do, whether it's a puzzle to solve or something to formalize or, whatever whatever it is, we need to go and do that work. And that's, to me, is what like learning is all about, in all the different ways that learning kind of expresses itself.
Hey, Pete,
Yep.
could we in one circle of brilliance or two, maybe just explore the master stream again?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm more than happy to do that. So,
Yep.
yep, we can, yeah. And because I think you're absolutely right. Now, again, if you're outside of the red circle, then something really uh, problematic is occurring. And that's a little bit of a more of a, we talked about before, do they need an intervention? What do they really need to get them back into play? And then we can use whatever our real, change work is really all about. So Wayne, that's really very, very interesting that you've just kind of shared that it goes in a different direction
Yeah,
around. I like that.
that's
I like that.
that's been for me one of those insights from this sort of exercise going, oh, now I actually see the difference between teaching and learning.
Tell us more
Because
about that. Yeah.
just if you're off learning, you go through that unconscious and conscious incompetence,
Yep.
competence
Yep.
cycling. So you're going clockwise. Whereas teaching means taking them through the exercise in an anti-clockwise Witterson's way and
hmm
making that experience that they're being guided through take them the opposite direction of what they would probably do by default.
Right. And isn't that interesting? Because that would also imply that in a well-structured learning environment, that whole counterclockwise circling might be confined to the inside of the green circle. But let's say we then take it, I'm thinking about this because of what Brian was saying, that here he is, a licensed physician, but wants to do something. So he has to come to the US. So he is forced to go completely through the education all over again, and have a lot more experience. So I thought was, I wonder then if like all the actual more classroom kind of learning is happening inside of the green circle. And then we say, like, let's take it beyond the classroom into something more experiential. Let's go and do some applied education, some practical kinds of stuff. That's probably more between the green and the red circle, because
Mhm.
now you're out there really interacting with life. However it happens to be. And certainly thinking about medicine in particular, once in a while, something's going to happen that's going to move everybody into a danger zone. So how can you handle the
Pandemic,
crisis?
pandemic.
Yeah, well, exactly. A pandemic, or even if you want to keep it just inside of a corporate setting, there's all kinds of corporate crises that end up occurring. And
Yep.
suddenly, we thought we were there to teach them something purely, the more on the intellectual side of things, and want to do something on the practical side of things. And suddenly crisis occurs. And now we can really say, well, crisis has occurred. Let's talk about how to use what you've just learned to handle whatever that dynamic happens to be.
That's
And
why I
so,
always say that there's a difference between acquisition behaviors, literally how you're processing that information in your brain, and application behaviors. And so if you look at
mm,
a lot of the technology that's out there, it overwhelms people with theory, it overwhelms people with information. I was talking about that with Wayne with like that Aura ring that I wear.
mhm,
The
mhm.
API monitors a lot of things, right? It's supposed to tell you about your circadian rhythms and sleep. It doesn't tell you what to do with the information.
Right, right.
You have all this information, it doesn't tell you what to do with it. I did my own research that said, okay, yeah, if you have cool sheets, you'll sleep better.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
didn't get that from the Aura ring. That was my own research that did
Of
it.
course, of course. So like, the ring created a certain awareness. But where do you end up moving that? And again, let's just take that all the way back to what we do anytime we're looking at any psychometric instrument. We love them all. I've never taken one I didn't go like, well, aren't I fascinating? I mean, I like them all, but they all, for the most part, they all end in the same place. And you've heard us say this before. They all end with the question, now what? So I now have all this awareness. Okay, now what? And that's where they tend to end their presentation, because they made you aware, and now they need someone like us, or some form of human development professional to come along and do something with that information. So yeah. Okay, so one last thing on the whole educational application. So Wayne, as I was saying, like perhaps it's more the classroom stuff is inside of the green circle, and then you cycle out to find some sort of actual experience, practical, whatever it is. Does that also map with your how you've put together your learning model with going counterclockwise?
I have not thought of it in terms of scaling from center outward.
Mhm.
My immediate gut reaction is, in many ways, the classroom is really pushed in grid,
Yeah,
right? We have everything showing up, maybe, but
yeah.
it's all much more muted than the rest of the world.
Hmm.
Mm,
Interesting. Yeah. So it shifts over to the in-grid side of things, period. But certainly I mean, I would have to think that I'm not in a 100 level class if they're going to throw me out into experiences.
mhm,
I'm probably going to do my 100 level class work and it's all going to be, the traditional lecture kinds of stuff. And then you get up to the 200, 300 level courses and they go like, all right, well, now it's time to start applying this to something. And then go beyond bachelor level when I certainly get out into master's level or doctoral level, or if I'm taking a more of a professional licensing kind of a program, whether that's being a physician or a nurse or a whatever pro it is, I'm sure they're going to start throwing me monkey wrenches just to
mm,
see how am I now able to apply what I learned tighter in to life as we leave that comfort of
Hmm.
being in that
And the
safe.
professor that I hated most in college was one who took a 100 level class and made it a 300 level class.
Yeah, yeah, threw you into the fire. Threw you
Yeah.
into the
And it was
fire.
statistics.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
sorry.
So
Yeah,
I do see much of that 100, 200, etc., scaling mapping to perceived challenge.
well, exactly. Exactly. Well, and I feel like part of it's going to be perceived challenge, but how, remember the other dimension may also apply to the 100, 200, 300 kind of grading system, and that's the amount of risk that someone is being exposed to. And so I think you're right. It definitely maps to perceived challenge. Um, but I might also go, maybe some of it is about moving me more out grid because I see myself as having the ability. Did we just basically say that well-structured education is inherently manipulative? So,
Hopefully it
uh,
would be, because
I'm
otherwise,
okay
what
with
are we
that.
paying for?
Well, right, exactly. I'm okay with that. If you guys ever look up the definition of the word manipulate, if you look at its roots, it really means to do something skillfully with the hands. So, yeah, anyway. All right. So very good. Okay. All right. So thanks everybody. Have a lovely weekend and we'll talk again on Tuesday.
See ya.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.